The day had started just like any other for a young black girl named Maya. She lived in a small, peaceful neighborhood where the streets were lined with trees and the air smelled fresh. Maya was deaf, which meant her world was mostly quiet, and she had learned to adapt to a life without sound. While many people found her condition challenging, Maya had always managed to stay strong, pushing herself to overcome the difficulties that came with it. She never saw herself as different, even though the world sometimes treated her that way. Maya's routine usually involved walking to the local park, where she liked to sit on the swings and watch the world go by. She loved to observe people, watching them chat, laugh, and play. Her own silence was a small price to pay for the peacefulness she felt when she was surrounded by nature. She carried a notebook with her to write down thoughts, ideas, or even observations about the people she saw. But on this day, things weren't going quite as smoothly as they usually did. Maya had been spending some time in the park, as usual, but she felt a growing unease. Her family, who had always been her rock, had gone off to run some errands, leaving her alone for a while. It wasn't the first time she had been by herself, but something didn't feel right today. The crowds at the park were thin, and the trees looked slightly different, as though something was off in the air. Maya's sense of unease grew as the minutes passed. She checked her phone, but the battery was dead. She sighed, wishing she hadn't forgotten to charge it earlier. She didn't realize how much time had passed until she glanced around and realized that the park had emptied out. The place was quiet, far too quiet for comfort, and when she turned to leave, she noticed that she had lost track of which way she had come from. She tried retracing her steps, but the pathways all seemed the same, blending into one long, unfamiliar stretch of greenery. A wave of panic washed over her. Maya knew she had to get back to where her family was, but every turn seemed to lead her deeper into unfamiliar territory. She stopped, trying to stay calm, but she couldn't help feeling helpless. Her heart began to race as she realized that not only was she lost, but she also had no way of getting help quickly. No one had noticed her distress because she couldn't shout or call out for help the way others could. In a moment of desperation, she remembered something she had read about in books, an SOS signal. She had learned a few basic signs to help communicate in emergencies, and now it seemed like the right time to use them. Maya, with trembling hands, formed the simple yet powerful sign for SOS. 3 short motions, 3 long motions, and 3 short ones again. She repeated the motions several times, hoping someone would see her and come to her aid. At first, it felt silly to do something so dramatic, but Maya quickly realized it was the only thing she could think of to get someone's attention. She glanced around, hoping that someone, anyone, would notice. Little did she know, across the park, there was a man who had been watching her all along. A veteran, someone who had seen countless things in his life, including moments of distress that many people might overlook. When he saw the SOS signal, something clicked inside him. He didn't hesitate, recognizing the urgency of the situation. He had been trained to see the signs in his own way. But this was different. There was something about this young girl, her silent plea for help, that made him stand up and move toward her without a second thought. The moment of recognition was all it took. The veteran knew what he had to do. Maya stood still, her hand still forming the SOS signal in the air. She glanced around again, hoping for someone to notice. Her heart was beating faster now, her breaths shallow as anxiety took hold of her. The park was so quiet, and she felt utterly alone. The few people who had been there earlier had disappeared, and the sound of the wind through the trees was the only thing that filled the air. The thoughts racing through her mind weren't helpful. Was anyone even going to see her? Was she going to be stuck here forever? She tried to keep her hands steady, but they trembled from the nervousness creeping through her. She knew this was the right thing to do, but the fear that no one would respond was almost too much to bear. Maya wished she could speak, wished she could just ask for help the way others could, but her silence had always been both her strength and her challenge. She had become used to it over the years, but now, in this moment of panic, It felt like a barrier between her and the world. Maya lowered her hands for a moment, her mind racing through all the possible solutions. Maybe someone would pass by and notice her distress. She could try to signal to them again, but there was no guarantee they'd understand. She had learned the SOS signal a long time ago, in case something like this ever happened, but she never thought she'd be in a situation where she'd need it. She took a deep breath and lifted her hands again. She tried to remain calm, repeating the signal in a smooth, deliberate motion. She couldn't give up. She had to stay strong. With each movement, she felt a tiny bit more hope, as if the act of signaling meant there was still a chance for rescue. Her eyes scanned the park again, but nothing had changed. No one had stopped to help, and the peaceful stillness around her felt suffocating. Meanwhile, across the park, there was a man who had been watching. He was an older man, dressed casually, with a quiet strength in his posture that made him seem different from the others who were out enjoying the day. The veteran had been taking a walk, his mind wandering back to the days when he had been in the service, facing battles and challenges far more dangerous than anything he encountered in this calm park. His life now was peaceful, and he appreciated the quiet, the simplicity. But something about the girl caught his attention. He had been walking along the path when he saw her. At first, he wasn't sure what she was doing. The motions of her hands seemed deliberate but out of place, like she was signaling for something. As he took a few more steps and watched her more closely, he realized what she was doing. She was signaling with the SOS gesture, the universal distress call. A sudden clarity hit him. This wasn't just a random movement. She was asking for help. His instincts kicked in immediately. There was no hesitation in his actions. He had seen this kind of thing before, though usually in much more intense situations. But this was still an emergency. The veteran, accustomed to dealing with urgent matters, didn't waste any time. He knew he had to approach her. The girl was alone, and she needed assistance. As he moved toward her, he felt a sense of urgency that he hadn't felt in years. It was a mix of empathy and a deep understanding of what the signal meant. Maya was still standing, her eyes searching for any sign of help, when she saw him. At first, she wasn't sure if he was approaching her for any particular reason. But as he got closer, his expression was calm, reassuring. Maya noticed the look in his eyes, the way he seemed to understand something without words. It was the kind of understanding that she had longed for in this moment, and in an instant, she felt a small wave of relief. She hadn't been ignored. Someone had seen her. Someone was coming to help. As the veteran drew closer to Maya, she felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her. There was relief that someone had finally noticed her SOS signal, but there was also a lingering uncertainty. She had never been good at asking for help. She had always been independent, figuring things out on her own. But today, everything felt different. The fear of being lost, the silence that had always been her world, and the overwhelming feeling of not being seen. It all weighed heavily on her. Yet, as the man stood before her, she felt a sense of calmness wash over her, even though she couldn't hear the reassuring words she knew he might say. The veteran stopped a few feet away from her, his presence strong but not intimidating. Maya looked up at him, her eyes searching for some sign of what he might do next. The man didn't say anything at first, but he gave her a reassuring nod. She noticed the way his eyes softened, as though he understood exactly what she was going through. In that moment, Maya felt something she hadn't expected, a sense of safety, as though, in his quiet presence, he would do whatever it took to help her. The veteran studied her for a moment, trying to gauge how to best communicate with her. He had learned the importance of reading people over the years, not just with his training, but from life experiences as well. He wasn't sure if Maya could hear him, but he didn't want to assume. So he took a careful step forward and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. It wasn't a grab or a forceful touch, just a soft gesture to let her know he was there. Maya looked up at him again, this time a little less tense. The touch was comforting, and it told her that this man was here for her, not to harm her. Still, she wasn't sure how to respond. She had never been in a situation where she had to rely on someone else for help, especially someone she didn't know. But her gut told her she could trust him. She looked into his eyes, trying to communicate with them. But the man didn't say anything yet. He seemed to understand that there was no rush. After a few moments, the veteran tried something else. Instead of speaking, he raised his hand slowly, mimicking the motion Maya had made earlier with the SOS signal. She blinked, surprised that he had recognized it right away. It was a simple gesture, but it conveyed so much. She nodded, feeling understood. The man wasn't just a stranger anymore. He had shown that he saw her distress. He understood. Maya then reached into her pocket, pulling out her notebook. She had always kept it with her for moments like this when words failed her. She scribbled a quick note, showing it to him. "I'm lost. My family is not here. I don't know how to get back." The veteran read the note, and his face softened with empathy. "I'll help you get back," he said, his voice calm and steady. Though Maya couldn't hear him, she could see his lips move. The reassuring look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. The fact that he wasn't rushing, that he was taking the time to understand her, made her trust him even more. Maya breathed a little easier, the tension in her chest easing up as the veteran extended his hand, not as a command but as an invitation. She hesitated for a moment, but then she took his hand, feeling a sense of relief she hadn't expected. She wasn't alone anymore. This stranger, a man who had recognized her distress, was now leading her out of the confusion and back toward safety. The two of them began walking side by side, the path ahead uncertain, but at least shared. And for the first time in a long while, Maya didn't feel so alone in the world. As Maya walked alongside the veteran, she couldn't help but notice how calm he seemed, as though he had been in situations like this before. The way he moved, the steady pace of his footsteps, made her feel a little less afraid. She had no idea who he was, but something about him made her feel like she was in safe hands. She couldn't hear his voice, but the quiet confidence he carried spoke volumes. Every so often, their eyes would meet, and Maya would see the kind reassurance in his gaze. It was a comforting feeling, knowing that someone cared enough to stop and help her when she needed it the most. As they walked, Maya found herself glancing around, trying to make sense of where they were. The park, which had once seemed like a familiar place, now looked unfamiliar, with the trees and pathways blurring together in a confusing mix. She felt a wave of embarrassment for not knowing where she had come from, but she pushed that feeling aside. Right now, what mattered was that she wasn't alone anymore. The veteran didn't rush her. He walked beside her, giving her space, but also making it clear he was there if she needed anything. He could sense her discomfort, though. There was a certain vulnerability in her that he could read even without words. He knew it wasn't easy for her to trust someone she had just met, but he also understood that sometimes people just needed someone to be there. He wasn't in a hurry, and that more than anything made Maya feel like she wasn't a burden. The quiet and steady presence beside her was exactly what she needed in this moment. Maya wanted to ask him something, to learn more about who he was and why he had decided to help her. But the words didn't come. She wasn't sure how to bridge the gap between them. All she knew was that she felt a little safer with every step they took together. The veteran, sensing her hesitation, didn't pressure her to talk. Instead, he simply kept walking beside her, offering her the space to speak when she was ready. After a few more steps, Maya felt a slight nudge of curiosity. She finally looked at him again, studying the lines of his face. He seemed older than most people she knew, his face carrying the weight of experience. His eyes were clear, and there was a depth in them that she couldn't quite place. Maya decided to take a chance, to communicate the best way she could. She pulled out her notebook again and scribbled something down. "Thank you for helping me. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't seen me." She showed him the note, watching as he read it, his expression softening with understanding. The veteran nodded slowly, and then, to her surprise, he gave her a small smile. He didn't say anything at first, but his smile was enough to reassure her. "You're welcome," he said quietly, his lips moving slowly. Maya caught the words with her eyes and felt her heart relax. It was the simple acknowledgement she had needed. There was a brief silence as they continued walking, and for the first time since she had found herself lost, Maya felt a sense of peace settling over her. She wasn't sure where they were going, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that she wasn't on her own anymore, lost in a world of uncertainty. This man, this veteran, was leading her back to safety, without asking for anything in return. In a world where people often turned a blind eye, his actions stood out as a rare moment of genuine kindness. Maya realized that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places, whether in the form of a stranger or a quiet, steady presence that understands your need for support without saying a word. And in that moment, walking side by side with this man, Maya understood the true power of human connection. As Maya and the veteran continued their walk through the park, she couldn't help but feel a sense of calm returning to her. The initial panic that had clouded her mind was slowly fading, replaced by a quiet trust in the man walking beside her. She had no idea who he was or what kind of life he had lived, but the more she observed him, the more she realized that there was something deeply reassuring about his presence. He wasn't rushing, wasn't pushing her to hurry or speak. He simply walked with her, as if time didn't matter in that moment. They passed through parts of the park that were familiar to Maya, though she couldn't remember the exact path she had taken earlier. She had been so caught up in her panic that she had lost track of her bearings. But with the veteran guiding her, she felt a quiet confidence returning. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't alone. There was someone beside her, someone who cared enough to stop and help. The veteran noticed Maya's occasional glances at the ground and the trees. He understood that she was trying to find her bearings, to make sense of the unfamiliar surroundings. As they walked, he kept his pace steady, never rushing her. He understood the value of patience, especially when it came to someone who might be struggling to feel safe. He had learned that in his years of experience, sometimes just being there for someone was all they needed. Words weren't always necessary. Finally, after a few minutes of walking in silence, the veteran stopped. Maya looked up at him, unsure of what was happening. He smiled at her and pointed to a nearby bench where they could sit for a moment. The park was still, and the breeze was gentle, making it the perfect spot to pause and take a breath. Maya hesitated for a moment, then nodded and followed him to the bench. As they sat down, she felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She didn't realize just how exhausted she was until she took a seat. The tension in her shoulders relaxed, and for the first time since she had gotten lost, she felt like she could breathe a little easier. The veteran sat beside her but didn't speak right away. He simply let her settle in, sensing that she needed a moment of quiet. Maya took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion she was feeling, it was the emotional weight of the fear she had carried with her. For so long, she had been alone in her struggles, facing the world in silence. But now, for the first time, she felt like someone truly understood her. Without thinking, Maya reached into her bag and pulled out her notebook again. She wrote something down, and as she turned it toward the veteran, she felt a strange sense of connection to him, even though they hadn't spoken much. The note read, "I don't know what I would have done without you. I feel so much safer now." The veteran read it, and this time, he didn't just smile. He nodded and gave her a look that made Maya's heart feel lighter. The warmth in his eyes told her that he had truly understood her gratitude. He didn't need words to know how much his actions had meant to her. It was enough that he had been there when she needed him most. After a moment of quiet reflection, the veteran finally spoke, his voice calm and steady. "It's not always easy, is it? But you've got more strength than you know." Maya looked at him, puzzled for a moment. He could tell she was unsure of what he meant, so he explained. "Sometimes just getting through the tough moments is a victory in itself. You handled this well. You didn't give up." Maya felt a smile tug at the corner of her lips. She hadn't really thought about it that way. She had been so focused on finding a way out of her fear that she hadn't realized how much strength it took just to keep going. And now, with someone beside her, helping her find her way, she felt a quiet sense of pride in herself. It wasn't about being perfect or strong all the time. It was about recognizing that even in the moments when you feel at your weakest, there's always a chance for things to get better. The veteran looked at her, his eyes warm with understanding. We all need a little help sometimes. You're not alone in this. Maya nodded, feeling the deep sense of appreciation for the man beside her. She still didn't know much about him, but that didn't matter. In this moment, he had been exactly what she needed, someone who saw her, understood her, and offered the help she didn't know how to ask for. And for that, she would be forever grateful. The gentle breeze rustled the leaves above them, and for a moment, everything felt still. Maya sat on the bench beside the veteran, feeling a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. The weight that had hung over her since she first realized she was lost was now slowly lifting. She had been terrified, unsure of what to do or where to turn. But now, with this stranger beside her, she felt like she could breathe again. The fear was still there, lingering in the background, but it was no longer consuming her. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. The veteran sat quietly beside her, his presence steady and calm. He had already shown her more kindness than most people ever would, but Maya couldn't help wondering about him. Who was he? Why had he decided to help her? They had barely spoken, but there was something about him that made Maya feel safe, as if she had known him far longer than just a few minutes. After a few moments of silence, Maya looked over at him. She had a question she wanted to ask, but she wasn't sure how to phrase it. Finally, she decided to take the plunge and try to bridge the gap between them, even if it meant starting with something simple. She reached into her bag and pulled out her notebook once again, scribbling down her thoughts. The page read, "How did you know I needed help?" She handed it to the veteran, watching as he read it. He paused for a second before looking up at her. There was a brief silence before he spoke, his voice gentle but steady. "I've been through some things in my life," he said, his words deliberate. "I've learned to pay attention when something's not right. And when I saw you signaling, I knew you needed help." Maya nodded, the answer making sense. She had been so focused on her own panic that she hadn't realized just how many people around her might have been trained to notice the signs of distress. It was something she had never really thought about before, but the veteran had seen it immediately, his instincts sharp from years of experience. As they continued to sit there, the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park. The world around them seemed to slow down, the atmosphere quiet and peaceful. For the first time in a long time, Maya felt like the world wasn't rushing by her. The veteran's calm presence helped her focus on the here and now, instead of worrying about what had happened or what might happen next. But eventually, the time for sitting and resting was over. The veteran stood up from the bench and looked down at Maya. She felt a small twinge of worry. What would happen next? She wasn't sure how far they had come or how much farther they had to go, but she knew that getting lost in the park had made her feel helpless. Still, there was something reassuring about the veteran's actions. He had never been in a hurry, and that was what Maya appreciated most. He had allowed her to process everything at her own pace. The veteran extended his hand, not as a command, but as an invitation. Maya looked at it for a moment, uncertain, but then she smiled and took it. She could feel a sense of trust beginning to grow between them, built not on words but on simple, unspoken actions. She wasn't sure where they were headed, but the fact that he was there, offering her guidance and support, gave her the courage to keep moving forward. Together, they started walking again, this time with a shared understanding between them. The veteran, with his quiet confidence, led the way, but Maya felt less like a follower and more like someone who was finding her way once again. She didn't feel like the girl who had been lost and panicked earlier. She felt stronger now, with every step. The quiet bond they had formed in this short time made all the difference. As they walked, Maya felt something stir inside her, a sense of gratitude for this unexpected connection. The world was still big, and there would always be moments of fear and uncertainty, but now she knew that help could come in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes it wasn't about finding the perfect solution, but about having someone by your side who cared enough to offer a hand when you needed it most. And that, Maya realized, was all she needed in that moment. As the veteran and Maya continued their walk, the feeling of uncertainty began to fade further. The quiet moments between them seemed to stretch out, and although neither of them spoke much, there was an unspoken understanding that wrapped around them like a blanket. The park, once a place of confusion and fear for Maya, now felt like a path leading her toward safety. She wasn't sure how far they had walked or how long it would take to get back to where she had last seen her family, but she knew that the veteran was with her, and that was enough. They walked slowly, each step purposeful. Maya had started to feel more at ease, and with every passing moment, her trust in the veteran deepened. There was something comforting about the way he moved, steady, unhurried, as though nothing could shake him. She, on the other hand, felt her thoughts begin to calm. She had been so afraid earlier, lost in her panic, but now everything seemed manageable. The park didn't seem so big anymore, and the world felt a little smaller. As they walked, Maya occasionally glanced at the veteran, studying his face for any signs of discomfort or impatience, but there were none. His calm demeanor was exactly what she needed, and it made her feel like, for once, she could stop worrying. After a while, the veteran turned to her and smiled softly. He didn't say anything at first, but his expression spoke volumes. Maya smiled back, feeling an unspoken bond growing between them. He hadn't just helped her physically by guiding her out of the park. He had also given her something that she hadn't realized she needed, a sense of peace. She hadn't known how much she longed for that quiet connection until it had been offered to her. They came across a small clearing where the sun's golden light filtered through the trees, casting warm beams on the ground. The park had started to feel more familiar again. Maya recognized the path ahead, the familiar benches and the fountain in the distance. She knew they were getting closer to the exit. The thought of seeing her family again, of being able to tell them that she was okay, filled her with a sense of relief. Still, there was something about the veteran's presence that made her reluctant to leave. She knew she had to, but part of her wished that this quiet moment could last just a little longer. The feeling of being understood, of being seen, was rare for her. Most of the time, she had to navigate the world on her own, figuring things out without asking for help. But now, for the first time in a long time, she felt that it was okay to lean on someone. It was okay to let someone else take the lead, even if just for a little while. As they approached the exit of the park, Maya realized how much this encounter had changed her. She had started the day full of fear and uncertainty, but now she was walking out of the park with a newfound strength. The veteran hadn't just helped her find her way physically. He had shown her that it was okay to trust others, and that there was strength in vulnerability. They reached the gate where Maya had first entered the park, and she paused, looking at the veteran. She felt a mixture of emotions, relief, gratitude, and even a little sadness. It was strange to think that just a short time ago, she had been lost, both physically and emotionally. But now she was standing at the edge of the park, ready to reunite with her family, and she felt like she had gained something important. Maya reached into her bag and pulled out her notebook once again. She wrote a quick message and handed it to the veteran. It simply read, "Thank you. I won't forget this." The veteran took the note and looked at her, his eyes softening. He nodded, giving her a smile that warmed her heart. "Take care of yourself," he said, and this time, Maya heard the words clearly in her mind, even though she couldn't hear them aloud. She nodded back, feeling a sense of closure, but also a deep appreciation for the kindness this stranger had shown her. As she turned to walk toward her family, she glanced over her shoulder and saw the veteran walking away. She felt a small sense of sadness that their paths were parting, but she also knew that their brief moment together would stay with her forever. The world was full of unexpected moments, Maya realized, and sometimes, the people you meet along the way leave an impression on your life that lasts longer than you expect. And in that moment, Maya knew she would always carry the memory of the day she was lost in the park, and the kind stranger who helped her find her way again. As Maya walked back toward her family, her heart felt lighter than it had all day. The familiar sights of the park were no longer just reminders of her fear. They were now part of a journey she had gone through, and more importantly, a lesson in trust and human connection. She glanced over her shoulder one last time, hoping to catch another glimpse of the veteran. But he was already out of sight, walking down the same path they had just taken together. Maya wasn't sure if she would ever see him again, but she knew she wouldn't forget him. She spotted her family ahead, still at the entrance where she had last seen them. Her mother and father were talking, but they both turned to look when they saw her walking toward them. Relief washed over their faces, and the tight knot that had been in Maya's stomach loosened. She had been afraid they might panic or worry when they couldn't find her, but now, seeing their familiar faces, everything felt like it was returning to normal. As she approached them, her mother rushed forward, wrapping her arms around Maya. "Where were you?" "We were so worried," her mother said, her voice filled with concern. Maya smiled, pulling back slightly to show her that she was okay. "I'm fine, Mom. I just got lost for a bit," she said, her voice calm, though the adventure she had been through played vividly in her mind. Her father, always the quieter one, walked over and gave her a gentle hug. "You're okay. That's all that matters," he said simply, his arms comforting in their own way. Maya nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude for her parents and their constant support. They were always there for her, but today she realized that sometimes other people could offer help in ways she had never imagined. The veteran had shown her that. He had given her not just the help she needed in that moment, but a sense of reassurance that would stay with her. The kindness of a stranger could change everything, she realized. As they walked together out of the park, Maya found herself reflecting on the day's events. It was strange to think about how quickly things had shifted, from feeling lost and alone to feeling found and understood. The park had once felt vast and intimidating, but now it felt like a place of growth. She had learned more about herself today than she had in a long time. She had learned that it was okay to ask for help, that it was okay to feel vulnerable, and that there was strength in trusting others. That night, as Maya lay in bed, she thought back to the veteran's words, "We all need a little help sometimes. You're not alone in this." Those words stayed with her, wrapping around her like a warm blanket. She realized that no matter what challenges came her way in the future, she wouldn't be facing them alone. There were always people who cared, even when it seemed like the world was silent. Maya also thought about how easy it was to assume that help would never come when you were lost or struggling. But today, she had learned the opposite. Help could appear when you least expected it, often from the most unlikely places. The veteran had been a reminder that kindness was not a rare gift, but something that was available in small moments, if only you were willing to recognize it. The next day, as Maya went about her usual routine, she carried a quiet sense of peace with her. She was no longer just the girl who had been lost in the park. She was someone who had found her way through an unexpected moment of kindness. It was a small moment, but it had made all the difference. Maya knew she would never forget that day, the day a stranger reached out to her when she needed it the most. And in the future, whenever she felt lost or uncertain, she would remember that there were always people who cared, people who would help if you let them. Her walk through the park had ended, but the lesson it had taught her would last far beyond that day. It was a lesson that would stay with her forever, reminding her that in a world that sometimes felt overwhelming, there was always room for kindness, understanding, and human connection.